The first sting was not the slap itself, but the way Veronica's eyes narrowed at me like I was dirt tracked across her polished floor. We were seated in the high-ceilinged office of Attorney Charles Hill on King Street in Charleston, the kind of room built for power with walls of oak and the quiet tick of an antique clock. I had chosen the plainest dress from my closet, a navy piece I had bought at Macy's on clearance, because I wanted to disappear into the background. After all, I was only Grace Sullivan, a nurse from Savannah Memorial Hospital, nothing more. The Whitmore relatives filled the long table with expensive silk sharp cologne and eyes that gleamed with hunger. Robert leaned back with a smirk as if rehearsing his victory. Cynthia dabbed at her eyes but peeked constantly at the sealed envelope in front of the lawyer. They were not here to mourn Edward Whitmore. They were here to carve up what he had left behind. Veronica's voice cut through the tension like broken glass. She rose suddenly, and before I could even take a breath, her palm cracked against my face. The blow was sharp, but her words cut deeper. "You are nothing but a lowly nurse from Savannah. You think standing in a sick room wiping old men's brows makes you family. You do not belong in this room." The sound of her voice was like poison poured across the table. Robert chuckled. Cynthia leaned in close to Veronica, whispering eyes glittering with delight at my humiliation. My cheek throbbed, my ears rang, and for a moment I saw myself as they wanted me to be small, humiliated, unworthy. I thought of the nights I walked hospital corridors when the world slept holding the hands of strangers as they took their final breaths. I thought of how I had scrubbed blood from my shoes, how I had stayed awake through 30-hour shifts, not for wealth, not for glory, but because dignity in suffering mattered. Yet here in this grand Charleston office, all of it was dismissed in one cruel gesture. I pushed back my chair, its legs scraping across the floor, echoing in the heavy silence. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The shame was suffocating, pressing down until I could hardly breathe. Every instinct screamed for me to run, to escape this room thick with scorn and greed. I reached for my bag ready to flee when Charles Hill's voice stopped me. "Miss Sullivan, may I have your full legal name?" His words hung in the air like a sudden crack of thunder. Every face turned startled. Veronica's lips curled in satisfaction, certain that the lawyer was about to dismiss me to put me in my place as an unwanted outsider. But his eyes were steady fixed not on her, but on me. My hand trembled against the strap of my bag. My lips parted, though no sound came. For the first time since the slap landed, I felt something shift a tremor beneath the polished surface of the room. My stepmother's cruelty had cut me raw, but beneath the sting, a different fire sparked one that whispered, this story was not finished. I was born in Richmond, Virginia in the spring of 1995, and for the first 10 years of my life, I thought my world, though modest, was safe. My father was a mechanic who loved country music and worked long hours in a garage off Broad Street. He smelled of oil and steel, but his hugs were warm, steady, unshakable. He used to call me his little compass because I always wanted to know where we were going and why. Then, on a rainy October night in 2005, everything collapsed. My father was driving home late when his truck collided with a tractor trailer on I-95. I remember the phone call, my mother dropping the receiver, the scream that ripped through our kitchen walls. At 10 years old, I learned how fragile everything could be. Grief turned our house hollow. My mother drifted through days with vacant eyes. Bills piled up. I began making dinners from whatever we had left in the pantry boxes of macaroni cans of beans, while she sat staring at the window. I used to think if I was quiet enough, maybe she wouldn't break. But grief didn't leave her. It hardened her into someone I barely recognized. Within 3 years, she remarried a man who carried the sharp smell of cheap bourbon everywhere he went. He was controlling his voice, always edged with threat, even when he was smiling. The home that had once held laughter now echoed with slammed doors and whispered arguments that ended with bruises she hid beneath long sleeves. By 2008, another figure entered my life. Veronica. She was not much older than 30, then polished, ambitious, with eyes that weighed and measured everyone. When she married into our fractured household, she looked at me not as a child in need of care, but as competition for attention and inconvenience standing in the way of her ambitions. She dressed in pearls even when we ate takeout fried chicken, and she made sure I understood my place. She never raised her hand at me, she didn't need to. Her tongue was sharper than any slap. She would smile sweetly in public, but at home, she would whisper in my ear, "You'll never be more than a servant. You think you'll escape this house. Girls like you end up forgotten." Her words sank deeper than I admitted at the time. I remember dinners where collard greens and cornbread steamed on the table, the food of the South rich with butter and salt. She would heap Robert and Cynthia's plates high when they visited, but she would glance at me and tilt her head toward the sink. "Dishes," she'd say, and my seat at the table would vanish. I would stand at the counter scrubbing while their laughter spilled from the dining room. Every scrape of the plates reminded me I was unwanted in my own home. Even then, though, something stubborn lived inside me. I would press my palm against the cool kitchen window, staring at the narrow street lined with maples, and whisper to myself that someday I would leave. I didn't know how or when, but I promised the girl in the glass that I would not stay broken here forever. My teenage years were measured not in birthdays or milestones, but in the weight of Veronica's voice pressing me down. By the time I turned 13, she had woven herself fully into the fabric of our home, dictating what we ate, what we wore, even how the curtains should be drawn in the morning. She carried herself as if the house was her kingdom, and I was an intruder trespassing on her throne. Every day was a reminder that I was less. She would glance at my hand-me-down shoes and smirk, telling me that girls who looked like me never made it past cashier jobs. She compared me to her niece Cynthia, who already had ballet recitals, tutors, and photographs lined up neatly in silver frames. My photographs were shoved in a drawer. The message was clear: I was invisible. Yet invisibility is a dangerous thing because it forces you to hear everything. I heard the late-night arguments when my stepfather's voice rose in anger. I heard Veronica whisper strategies for gaining more control over finances, more influence over church committees, more recognition in social circles. And always, I heard her quiet disdain whenever my name was mentioned. School became my refuge, but even there, she tried to reach me. She would comment on my report cards with a smile too sweet to be genuine. "Straight A's," she said one night while slicing pecan pie, as if grades could change the fact that you're nothing special. I learned to hide my notebooks beneath my pillow, my dreams scribbled in margins where her eyes could not find them. By 16, I had taken a part-time job at a diner off Broad Street. I saved every dollar hiding it in an old coffee tin beneath loose floorboards. Veronica found it once and emptied it with a laugh, saying it was childish to think freedom could be bought with tips from coffee refills. I wanted to scream, but instead I pressed the sound down into my ribs until it became fuel. That same year, I started volunteering at a local clinic. I watched nurses move through crowded waiting rooms with calm purpose, their voices steady, their hands sure. For the first time, I saw what it looked like to carry dignity, no matter who tried to strip it away. It lit a fire in me stronger than Veronica's cruelty. I knew then that my path would not end at her dining table or at her sink. At 17, when she cornered me during a family gathering, whispering that I would never amount to more than a burden, I met her eyes and did not look away. It was small, just a silent refusal, but it was the first time I let her see that her words no longer chained me. Inside, I was trembling, yet I carried myself upright. That moment marked the beginning of my resistance, quiet, but unyielding, a promise that when the chance came, I would not stay. On the night I turned 18, the house felt more like a cage than ever before. Veronica had planned a small dinner, though it was not for me. It was for appearances. She placed fried chicken and collard greens on the table with her usual false grace, then dismissed me with a flick of her hand, as if birthdays did not belong to unwanted girls. I sat in my room staring at the cracked ceiling until the sound of laughter downstairs grew unbearable. That was the moment I decided the promise I had whispered to myself as a child could no longer wait. I gathered the little money I had hidden from diner shifts, stuffed a change of clothes into a faded backpack, and wrote a single note for my mother. It said only, "I have to try." The Greyhound bus station on Broad Street smelled of diesel and damp paper. I bought a ticket south with shaking hands and climbed aboard just before midnight. The seat was torn, the air conditioning broken, but as the bus pulled onto I-95 and the lights of Richmond faded behind me, I felt the first breath of freedom fill my lungs. I pressed my forehead against the window and whispered goodbye, not just to a city, but to the years of humiliation that had pressed me down. The bus rolled through the dark highways of North Carolina and into the quiet dawn of Georgia. My stomach growled, but I hardly noticed. Every mile put distance between me and Veronica's voice. Every mile reminded me that I had chosen something different. When the driver finally called out Savannah, the sunlight spilled across the cobblestone streets and the air was heavy with salt from the river. I stepped down from the bus carrying nothing but determination. I found work quickly at a Waffle House on Abercorn Street. The pay was meager, but the clatter of plates and smell of coffee felt like life, not punishment. I saved each dollar for tuition, applied for scholarships, and soon after enrolled in nursing at Armstrong State University. I rented a tiny apartment with peeling paint, but it was mine. At night, I studied until my eyes ached, and in the mornings I worked extra shifts. The exhaustion was bone deep, but no one dismissed me from a table or sneered at me as less. I was free to shape myself, and for the first time I believed I could. I carried the memory of Veronica's words like scars beneath my skin, but they no longer controlled me. They became reminders of what I had escaped. Richmond was behind me. Savannah was my beginning, and though I did not yet know it, the path I had chosen would one day lead me back into a room where Veronica's voice would rise again, and this time she would not win. By the time I was 28, nursing had become not just a career, but a calling carved from every scar of my past. Savannah Memorial Hospital consumed my days and often my nights. I moved through its sterile hallways with practiced steps answering the quiet cries of patients too weak to lift their voices. It was exhausting work, but it gave me purpose, the kind of dignity I had once promised myself I would claim. Yet one gray February morning in 2020 to 23, everything shifted with a single phone call. I was drinking lukewarm coffee from the hospital vending machine when my supervisor Janet called. Her voice carried the weight of hesitation, the kind she only used when about to ask something unreasonable. "Grace," she said, "I have a private care request. High pay. Very high. But the patient has burned through 5 nurses in 6 months." I nearly laughed. After endless 12-hour shifts, the last thing I wanted was a second job with a reputation for disaster. I started to decline, but Janet pressed on. "It is Edward Whitmore." The name alone pulled me upright. Even in Savannah, his reputation was legend. A billionaire shipping magnate from Charleston, owner of a sprawling estate on South Battery, a man whose empire of cargo ships had stretched across oceans. Wealthy, powerful, impossible to please. Janet continued, "He is terminal, pancreatic cancer. His family has begged us to find someone who can last more than a week. They are offering double your hospital rate." I hesitated, picturing long nights, impossible demands, the risk of failure. But then I thought of student loans still looming, of the dream I held close to open a free clinic for women like my mother who had nowhere to turn. Maybe this was my chance to gather enough to make that dream real. "All right," I said, "but I want to meet him first." That Saturday, I drove the 2 hours north to Charleston. Crossing the Ravenel Bridge, the city spread before me, church steeples piercing the sky, the Ashley River shimmering below. When I turned onto South Battery, I slowed, staring at the row of mansions framed by ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss. The Whitmore estate stood out even among them. Black wrought iron gates guarded a red brick mansion with white columns that reached toward the sky. The air smelled of salt and jasmine. My throat tightened. I was about to step into a world I had only glimpsed from the outside. The housekeeper, Mrs. Clark, a stern woman with steel gray hair, led me through echoing halls filled with oil paintings and antique furniture that looked too fragile to touch. "He is having a bad day," she warned as she opened the heavy study door. Inside, Edward Whitmore sat in a leather chair by the window, overlooking manicured gardens. His frame was small, thinned by illness, but his eyes burned sharp and assessing. When he saw me, his mouth twisted. "Another nurse," he said dismissively. "How long do you think you will last?" I steadied my breath and pulled a chair close enough to meet his gaze. "That depends," I answered. "How long do you think you will need me?" For the first time, his eyes flickered with something like surprise. The first week inside the Whitmore mansion felt like walking a tightrope over open water. Edward tested me at every turn as if daring me to fail the way others had before. On the very first morning, I entered his study carrying a tray with oatmeal and tea, only to have him glance at it and snap, "I asked for toast, not mush." My instinct was to apologize, but I steadied myself, set the tray down, and said calmly, "Oatmeal is easier on the stomach with your medication. Eat what you can, and if you hate it, I will make toast tomorrow." He glared at me for a full minute, the silence heavy before muttering, "We will see." Another afternoon, I tried to help him from his chair to begin light stretching exercises. His hands shook with pain, yet he yanked his arm away, snarling, "Do not treat me like a child." My voice quivered, but I kept it steady. "Then do not act like one Mr. Whitmore." For a heartbeat, I thought he might throw me out right then, the way he had dismissed every nurse before me, but instead, something shifted in his eyes, a flash of reluctant respect, and he allowed me to guide him through each motion. Every day became a battle of wills. He demanded newspapers arranged in precise stacks, medicine delivered at exact minutes, windows adjusted for light, he claimed was never right. When I misjudged, he scolded. When I stood firm, he studied me like a puzzle. At night, I drove back to my small Savannah apartment, bone-tired, wondering how long I could keep up the game. Yet each morning, I returned. Beneath the sharp edges of his commands, I sensed something else, not cruelty, but fear. A man fighting to keep control as his body betrayed him. One evening near sunset, he asked abruptly, "How many hours do you work at the hospital?" I told him about double shifts, about nights spent rushing from one patient to another, about watching strangers take their last breaths without family nearby. He stared out the window for a long time, then said softly, "You know something about loneliness." His tone was not a question, but a statement, as if he recognized it in me the way I had recognized it in him. After that, the air between us shifted. He still barked orders and snapped when his pain grew worse, but I saw how his eyes lingered when I stood my ground, how his voice softened slightly when I spoke with honesty rather than fear. He had built walls as tall as the mansion itself, but each day I stayed those walls cracked just enough to let me glimpse the man inside. By the third week, something unexpected began to grow between us. Not warmth exactly, but the faint outline of trust. Each morning I found Edward waiting in his study, the newspapers already stacked at his side. Instead of demanding silence, he would gesture toward the chair across from him and say, "Sit." At first, the conversations were clipped simple questions about my shift schedule or what book I carried in my bag, but soon they stretched longer. He wanted to know why I had chosen nursing. I told him about the free clinic where I had first volunteered, about watching frightened mothers cradle sick children in crowded waiting rooms, about the steady hands of the nurses who gave those families dignity. He listened without interruption, his gaze steady and uncharacteristically gentle. One afternoon, as the late sunlight spilled across the rugs, he asked about my family. The question nearly closed my throat. I told him about my father, the accident on I-95, the years of silence that followed. I mentioned my mother only briefly, then the way Veronica had entered our home like a storm. His eyes narrowed at her name, as if the very syllables carried a stench. "She does not sound like someone who values loyalty," he said finally. I laughed bitterly, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Loyalty was never part of her vocabulary. Edward leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You have survived more than most," he said. "Do not dismiss that." It was in those hours that I glimpsed the man beneath the armor. He told me about the Depression years, about shining shoes at 12, about working on the docks to save every penny. He spoke of building his shipping empire brick by brick until he owned vessels that crossed oceans carrying goods from ports I had only read about. Yet when I asked about family, his words faltered. He admitted his wealth had cost him connection. Relatives who once laughed with him now called only when they needed money. Old friends faded when illness arrived. He lifted a trembling hand toward the garden outside, its hedges trimmed to perfection. All this he said, and not one person to sit with me at dinner without checking their watch. His voice cracked, then steadied, as if ashamed to show weakness. That evening, as I gathered my things, he stopped me. "You know, Miss Sullivan, you do not cower. Most people do." My hand froze on the door. I thought of Veronica's sneer, the way I had been shoved aside at every table. "No," I said softly. "I have had enough of cowering." For a moment, the stern billionaire and the weary nurse simply regarded each other two lives, separated by decades and fortune, bound by something neither had expected. Loneliness answered with recognition. As spring unfolded in Charleston, the sharpness in Edward's voice softened into something almost paternal. The mansion that had once felt like a fortress began to echo with conversation instead of silence. Some afternoons we sat on the wide veranda overlooking the Ashley River, where the breeze carried the scent of salt and magnolia. He would sip sweet tea while I read aloud from Mark Twain or the Wall Street Journal, and though he often interrupted with sharp commentary, I noticed the faint smile tugging at his mouth. One evening he pointed to the horizon streaked with orange and said, "I used to think sunsets were for the idle. Now they remind me that time is running out." His words lingered heavy in the air, and I felt the weight of his loneliness press against me. It was during those weeks that he began asking about my dreams, not just in passing, but with real curiosity. I told him about my wish to one day open a free clinic in Savannah for women trapped in situations like my mother women who needed both medical care and a safe place to start again. He did not laugh or dismiss the idea as fanciful the way Veronica once had. Instead, he leaned forward, eyes burning with intensity, and asked, "How would you fund it? What staff would you hire? How would you keep it alive when donations ran dry?" For the first time, I spoke of budgets and volunteers and long hours as if it were already real, and he listened, nodding slowly. "You have the heart of a builder," he said, "not a dreamer." The bond grew quietly but undeniably. When pain left him bedridden, he refused to allow anyone else to adjust his pillows or administer his medicine. Only Grace, he would insist. Mrs. Clark raised her brows but complied. He began calling me not Miss Sullivan but Grace, and once, late at night, when I found him struggling to breathe, he gripped my hand and whispered, "You are the daughter I never had." The words struck me deeper than I could admit. For years, I had been treated as less than nothing, but here in this mansion with a man the world called impossible, I was being seen not as a servant, not as a burden, but as family. Unbeknownst to me, he had already begun meeting quietly with Charles Hill. I would hear the faint echo of their voices behind closed doors or see papers spread across his desk, but when I asked, he would only say, "I am making arrangements." Looking back, I realized those evenings on the veranda and those conversations about my clinic were not idle talk. They were seeds he was planting decisions he had already set in motion. While his relatives circled like vultures waiting for his death, Edward Whitmore was rewriting the ending of his own story, and without knowing it, he was rewriting mine too. By late spring, the rhythms of the Whitmore mansion had shifted so completely that even Mrs. Clark admitted she had never seen the old man so content. What had started as battles of will gradually became routines marked by small but significant gestures. Edward would wait each morning with the newspapers stacked in meticulous piles. Yet instead of shoving them toward me, he would ask my opinion on headlines. When the stock market dipped, he demanded to know what I thought it meant for working families. When a hospital in Atlanta closed due to funding cuts, he leaned forward, listening intently as I described how it would affect patients with nowhere else to turn. It surprised me how much he valued my perspective. I was a nurse with modest means, and he was a billionaire with decades of power, yet in those conversations we met on level ground. Evenings often carried us to the garden, where azaleas bloomed in fierce pinks and whites. He would point out each plant, calling them by name, reciting histories of how his mother once tended them before he could afford professional gardeners. Sometimes he grew quiet, staring at the hedges as if measuring the distance between what he had built and what he had lost. One night, he confessed that he feared his legacy would be reduced to balance sheets and lawsuits. "What good is an empire if no one remembers you with kindness?" he asked. His voice cracked on the word kindness. I told him that kindness could not be bought, but it could be chosen, and that in his final months, he still had the power to choose it. He studied me in silence, the weight of his gaze heavy yet not unkind, and finally nodded. "You remind me that the end does not have to be empty," he said. In the weeks that followed, he began sharing stories I suspected he had hidden from everyone else. tales of his sister Willow, the only person who ever challenged him with love rather than greed, and how losing her to distance and silence had carved a hollow place he never filled. He showed me a faded photograph tucked in a leather-bound book, a girl with bright eyes who looked hauntingly familiar. My grandmother, I realized, though I kept the recognition to myself. The pieces of my life and his were aligning in ways neither of us yet dared to name. Each time he spoke of Willow, his voice softened, and each time he looked at me afterward as though searching for a reflection of her. What I offered instead was not bloodline, but presence. I listened. I stayed. I treated him as more than a patient or a paycheck, and in doing so, I became something he had almost given up on: family. Not by name, but by choice. Edward was not a man who handed out trust easily, and even as our conversations deepened, he still tested me as if needing constant proof that my care was not another mask. One afternoon, he deliberately left an envelope of cash on the side table beside his chair, thick enough to tempt anyone who had spent years stretching paychecks. I noticed it when I came in to check his blood pressure. For a moment, my eyes lingered the memory of unpaid rent and medical textbooks gnawing at me, but I picked it up, slid it back into the drawer, and recorded his numbers as if nothing had been there. He said nothing at first, but later that evening, as the shadows lengthened, he asked quietly, "Did you not see the envelope?" I met his gaze and answered, "I am here to take care of you, not to take from you." His lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, and he leaned back, satisfied. On another day, he asked my opinion about a family dispute recounted in the paper where heirs were suing one another for control of an estate. "What would you do if you suddenly had millions?" he asked, his eyes sharp. I thought of my clinic dream of mothers sitting in crowded waiting rooms with sick children. I told him plainly that I would build a place where people could walk in without fear of bills they could not pay. He pressed harder. "What if the money ran out?" I answered, then I would keep working. My voice trembled with honesty but also with defiance. He studied me as though committing my words to memory. There were moments when his tests carried a sting. He once accused me of being like everyone else waiting for him to die. The words pierced, but I steadied myself and replied, "You are not just a dying man to me. You are someone still living, and I will not waste the time you have left treating you as anything less." His face softened, and for the first time he reached for my hand. "Your words remind me that I still exist," he whispered. That night, I left the mansion shaken not because of his accusation, but because I realized he was choosing me as the measure of his final days. Each test seemed designed not to trip me, but to confirm what he desperately wanted to believe, that goodness still existed, that loyalty without greed could be real. And each time I passed another unspoken trial, his conviction grew stronger. I began to see it in the way he spoke of his relatives with increasing bitterness, how he dismissed their shallow visits and instead asked me to sit longer in the evenings. The wealth he had once guarded like armor was becoming in his mind a tool, and I was the one who had shown him how it might finally be used for something beyond vanity. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Edward's defenses lowered more than ever before. The house was still, the heavy curtains drawn against the glare of the Charleston sun, and the steady hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence. He sat in his chair, a blanket draped over his knees, his eyes distant as if staring through decades. Without prompting, he began to speak of choices that had shaped his life, not with pride, but with something closer to sorrow. "I built an empire," he said, "ships and contracts and towers of steel, but every brick cost me something. I postponed marriage because there was always another deal, another expansion. I postponed children because I thought there would be time later. Later never came." His voice broke, and for the first time I saw tears glisten against the deep lines of his face. "I could have had a family grace. Instead, I had boardrooms and lawyers. Now those lawyers sit with me in my final days, and not one child calls me father." The weight of his confession settled heavy on my chest. I knelt beside his chair, took his frail hand in mine, and told him softly, "You are not the only one who made mistakes. My mother remarried for security, not love, and it left me with scars that still ache. Regret is heavy, but it is not the whole story. What matters is what we do with the time that remains." He turned to me with eyes that seemed almost desperate. "Do you think it is too late for me to leave something good behind?" I squeezed his hand. "No," I said. "It is never too late to choose differently. Kindness counts even in the final chapter." His lips trembled as he whispered, "You sound like Willow." The name startled me. He spoke then of his sister, my grandmother, with a mixture of admiration and bitterness of how they had parted ways over his hunger for wealth and her devotion to family. I listened as he pieced together memories like fragile glass hearing in every word, the loneliness of a man who realized too late the cost of his ambition. My heart ached not just for him, but for the girl inside me who had once begged for love at Veronica's table and been denied. In that moment, something passed between us, not spoken, but felt. He had spent a lifetime commanding respect, yet here he sought forgiveness. I had spent a lifetime being dismissed, yet here I offered him dignity. The exchange sealed something deeper than nurse and patient. It felt like family, fragile and unexpected, but real. By early summer, the change in Edward was undeniable. Where once he filled his days with rigid schedules and sharp commands, he now leaned into long conversations about what would remain after he was gone. I often found him with papers spread across the desk and his study diagrams of properties, lists of accounts, letters drafted in his careful hand. Whenever I entered, he would cover them quickly with a book or clear his throat as if caught in some mischief. When I pressed, he would only say, "I am making sure everything is taken care of." Yet his questions to me grew more pointed. How much would it cost to build a clinic in Savannah? How many beds would be needed? What staff would be essential? At first, I laughed thinking he was indulging me, but the way he scribbled notes told me otherwise. One evening, he asked, "If you had the means to make this real, would you give your life to it?" I answered without hesitation, "Yes, because no one should be turned away when they are sick, simply because they are poor." He closed his eyes and nodded as though he had been waiting for that answer. He began calling Charles Hill to the mansion more frequently. I would hear the murmur of their voices drifting from the library, the rustle of documents, the low cadence of decisions being made. Once I passed by and heard my name spoken clearly before the door clicked shut. A chill ran through me, though I said nothing. I did not dare imagine what it could mean. Still, the signs multiplied. He asked me to sort through his shelves of books, telling me to set aside those that had comforted him so they might comfort others. He instructed Mrs. Clark to keep careful inventories of household staff payments, as if ensuring they would be protected. He even showed me an old photograph album and placed it gently in my lap. "These are pieces of a family I once had," he said. "I want you to know them." On a humid evening when rain tapped against the tall windows, he turned to me with sudden intensity. "Grace, do you believe legacy is measured in money or in people?" My throat tightened. "People," I whispered. "Always people." His shoulders eased, and he whispered back, "That is why I trust you." In that moment, I understood that whatever arrangements he was making were not for the Whitmores who circled outside his door. He was preparing something larger, something that carried my name in its foundation, though I did not yet know how. While the vultures waited for his death, Edward Whitmore was quietly writing a different ending, and though the ink was not yet dry, I was already bound to it. The morning of Edward's funeral, the city of Charleston carried a hush as if even the air understood the weight of what was about to unfold. St. Philip's Church stood solemn and white against the gray sky, its tall spire piercing the clouds, its bells tolling with slow, deliberate rhythm. I arrived early, my simple black dress clinging in the humid air, and sat near the back pew while mourners filed in. The Whitmore relatives swept through the doors in sleek black cars and designer clothes, their faces fixed in masks of grief that looked too carefully rehearsed. Veronica led the way in a fitted dress and pearls, her chin lifted as though this were her stage. Robert strode behind her, eyes restless, scanning the room as if already searching for his share of inheritance. Cynthia followed with her tissue, dabbing theatrically at dry eyes. The service itself was brief, more ritual than remembrance. A minister spoke of Edward's accomplishments in shipping his wealth, his contributions to civic causes, yet the words felt hollow to me. Not once did he mention the man who had confessed his regrets on quiet afternoons, who had clutched my hand with trembling fingers, who had called me the daughter he never had. Around me, the congregation shifted impatiently. They were not here to honor him. They were here because the reading of his will was scheduled for the very next day, and none of them wanted to risk missing a detail. After the final hymn, the family hosted a reception in the church hall. Long tables groaned under the weight of shrimp and grits pecan pies and pitchers of sweet tea, the staples of Southern funerals. I stood at the edge of the room, plate untouched, listening as conversations swirled. Robert leaned close to a cousin, whispering, "I cannot wait to see my share his laugh coarse and careless." Cynthia drifted from group to group, murmuring about how Edward had always promised to take care of family. Veronica, of course, held court at the center, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a wealthy church elder, her voice carrying as she proclaimed, "Edward knew where loyalty truly lay." Each word stung like vinegar. I kept silent, invisible as always, though inside me, memories of Edward's trust pulsed strong. He had said he was making arrangements. He had said he trusted me, and yet, surrounded by this sea of entitlement, I wondered if I had misunderstood, if in the end his fortune would simply be carved apart by the same greedy hands he had despised. When the reception ended and the crowd thinned, I walked outside beneath the moss-draped oaks of Church Street. The evening sun burned low and the air was thick with cicadas. My heart ached with grief, but also with dread. Tomorrow in Charles Hill's office, the truth would be spoken aloud. Tomorrow I would learn whether Edward's trust had truly been meant for me, or whether I was just a nurse, foolish enough to believe I mattered. The next afternoon, the Whitmore family converged on King Street, where Charles Hill's law office occupied the second floor of a stately brick building that had once been a bank. The brass plaque on the door gleamed in the late sunlight, as if warning that only truth would be spoken inside. I arrived early, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Mrs. Clark Edwards' housekeeper gave me a small nod as I entered. Mr. Allen, the longtime driver, sat stiffly in a chair near the window, his cap in his lap. Their presence steadied me. They, too, had known Edward beyond his fortune. The conference room stretched long and narrow, its mahogany table polished to a mirror. Leather chairs lined either side, and at the far end, piles of documents waited beneath Charles Hill's careful hands. Slowly, the family poured in. Veronica arrived first, perfume thick in the air, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She surveyed the room with the entitlement of someone who believed the estate already belonged to her. Robert followed with a swagger, loosening his tie, as though he were stepping into a victory party. Cynthia drifted behind, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her every gesture designed for sympathy. Other cousins and distant relatives filled the remaining chairs, their whispers sharp as knives. I slid into the last seat at the far end of the table, trying to disappear into the woodwork. Veronica's gaze found me instantly, her lips curled into a sneer. "Of course she's here," she said loudly enough for the room to hear. "The nurse who thinks tending to an old man entitles her to sit with family." A ripple of laughter passed through the younger cousins. My cheeks burned, but I lifted my chin, refusing to show weakness. Charles Hill entered, then tall, composed, his gray suit impeccable. He adjusted his glasses, surveyed the restless group, and cleared his throat. "We are here to honor the final wishes of Mr. Edward Whitmore. I ask that all present show respect for the process." His voice cut through the murmurs, but tension still simmered under the surface. Robert leaned back in his chair, arms crossed as if daring the lawyer to disappoint him. Cynthia sniffled theatrically. Veronica folded her arms, her pearls glinting like armor. I could feel every pair of eyes sliding toward me, questioning my presence. I wanted to vanish, yet something within whispered that I belonged here, that Edward's insistence I attend had meaning beyond courtesy. My pulse raced, my palms damp against the table. Outside the window, King Street bustled with carriages and tourists. But inside the room, time felt suspended, every second stretching as we waited for the words that would divide past from future. The air inside the conference room grew thicker by the minute as Charles Hill shuffled his papers into order. Every creak of the leather chairs, every tap of a pen echoed like thunder in the silence. I tried to steady my breathing, to focus on the dark wood grain of the table, but I could feel Veronica's gaze burning into me. She had been biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and when Charles paused to pour himself a glass of water, she pounced. "Really?" Charles, Veronica said, her voice sharp and brittle like glass ready to shatter. Is there a reason this girl is here? She's not family, she's just a nurse. A lowly nurse who scrubbed floors at Savannah Memorial when she wasn't busy wiping Edward's chin. Surely this isn't her place. Her words cracked across the room, each syllable landing like a lash. Robert smirked. Cynthia pressed her hand dramatically to her chest, and several of the cousins tittered in agreement. My throat tightened, shame flooding me like fire, yet I forced myself to hold her stare. My voice trembled but remained steady. Mr. Hill asked me to attend. I am here because Edward wanted me here. Veronica's laugh was cold and cutting. Edward was confused at the end, weak, vulnerable. You took advantage of that, didn't you? You hovered around him whispering sweet stories, feeding him your little sob tales about a rough childhood, hoping he might take pity on you. Admit it, that's why you're here. Her words sliced through me, unearthing old wounds, but beneath the humiliation, there was a stubborn ember that refused to die. I heard Edward's voice in memory, steady and warm. You reminded me that the end does not have to be empty. I gripped the edge of the table and spoke softly. I never asked Edward for anything. I only gave him the care he deserved. For a moment, silence fell, but Veronica leaned forward, her eyes glittering with venom. Care, she spat. Do not flatter yourself. You were nothing more than a paid servant. The idea that you belong at this table is laughable. Her words hung heavy, daring me to crumble. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. My instinct screamed to flee to escape the cruel eyes fixed upon me. I gathered my purse ready to stand to leave this suffocating room and its poisonous laughter. But then Charles Hill's voice rang out firm and commanding, halting me in place. Miss Sullivan, please remain seated. His gaze swept the room, silencing even Robert. You are exactly where Mr. Whitmore wished you to be. The room froze, every head swiveling toward me. My heart thundered as I sank slowly back into my chair. Something irreversible was about to unfold, and though Veronica's sneer widened in triumph, she had no idea that the ground beneath her was about to give way. Charles Hill adjusted his glasses, his measured calm slicing through the tension like a blade. The room seemed to lean forward, every cousin and vulture-eyed relative straining to hear the words that would finally reveal the fate of Edward Whitmore's fortune. He cleared his throat and began to read from the thick document before him. At first, his words were ordinary, modest bequests to charities, small sums set aside for longtime employees, tokens of gratitude that drew groans of impatience from the Whitmores. Robert tapped his fingers against the table. Cynthia sniffled louder. Veronica rolled her eyes in disdain. But then the cadence shifted, and now Charles intoned regarding the entirety of my remaining estate, including properties, investments, and assets valued at approximately $50 million. The room fell into such silence I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I leave everything. He continued to Grace Elizabeth Sullivan. For one eternal second, no one breathed. Then the room exploded. Robert shot to his feet, face red, shouting, "This is insane! She's nobody! She's a nurse!" Cynthia gasped, her hand trembling against her throat, then wailed, "She must have manipulated him!" Veronica's chair screeched back as she rose, her face twisted with rage. "I will not accept this!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You tricked him. You wormed your way into his life, and you stole what was rightfully ours." I sat frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might faint. The words swirled around me in a storm of fury, yet I could only hear Edward's voice echoing in memory. You reminded me that the end does not have to be empty. Tears blurred my vision as the reality sank in. He had chosen me, not as a nurse, not as a servant, but as family. Charles Hill raised his hand, his voice firm. You may contest if you wish, but I should warn you, Mr. Whitmore anticipated your reaction. He left behind detailed documentation of his decision-making process, including video statements recorded in my presence. His wishes are unequivocal. He opened a folder and revealed a sealed envelope. There is also a letter addressed to Miss Sullivan." Veronica lunged toward the table, her hand snatching for the documents, but two security staff stepped forward, blocking her with quiet authority. The cousins gasped, murmurs rippling through the room like wildfire. Robert cursed under his breath, slamming his fist against the table so hard the glasses rattled. Cynthia buried her face in her hands, sobbing with fury rather than grief. I sat trembling, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. The chaos around me, blurred voices rising in outrage, but I felt as if I were underwater, held steady by Edward's unseen presence. He had given me more than money. He had given me vindication. In the very space where Veronica had sought to humiliate me, Edward's voice had risen through Charles Hill's reading to declare me worthy. And as the family's fury thundered around me, a quiet strength took root inside my chest. The battle had just begun, but the tide had already turned. The room had not yet recovered from the shock when Charles Hill lifted his hand for silence. His calm, deliberate movements carried more weight than the shouts and curses bouncing off the walls. Slowly, the noise subsided, though Robert still fumed, his fists clenched, and Cynthia continued her theatrical sobbing. Veronica stood rigid, her face frozen in a mask of disbelief, pearls trembling against her collarbone as though even they could not bear the tension. Charles adjusted his glasses and said evenly, "Mr. Whitmore anticipated that this day might become contentious. He left behind additional documentation to ensure clarity, and he requested that I share a video message with you all." Gasps rippled across the table. A video Robert barked a laugh, half derision, half panic. "Oh, please! You expect us to believe some manipulated recording? She probably coached him." He jabbed a finger toward me as if I were on trial. I flinched but did not look away. Charles ignored him and gestured to his assistant. Moments later, the lights dimmed and the screen at the end of the room flickered to life. Edward's face appeared thin and pale, yet his eyes sharp and steady. He sat in his library, the shelves of leather-bound books rising behind him like silent witnesses. My chest tightened at the sight of him, the ache of loss rushing back fresh. "If you are watching this," Edward began, his voice gravelly but resolute, "it means I am gone. And it means you are gathered here to hear how I chose to leave behind the fortune I built over a lifetime." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the camera as though staring directly at each of us. "I know some of you came today expecting wealth. You came not to mourn me, but to calculate what you could buy. You have treated me not as a man, but as a bank account, and I will not allow my final act to be feeding that hunger." The room went utterly still. Even Cynthia lowered her tissue, her mouth hanging open. Edward leaned forward slightly, his eyes fierce. "I chose to leave my estate to Grace Sullivan because she gave me what none of you ever offered: dignity, compassion, and truth. She listened when I spoke. She saw me when I was weak. She reminded me I was still alive, not just dying." Tears blurred my vision, my hands trembling in my lap. Around me, the family shifted, their faces pale, their outrage faltering under the steady blow of Edward's words. Veronica gripped the back of her chair until her knuckles whitened. Robert muttered curses under his breath. Edward's voice filled the room once more. "You may rage. You may scheme. But this decision is mine and mine alone. If you challenge it, you will fail because I left evidence of every step." The video faded into silence, leaving Edward's words echoing through the conference room like the toll of a final bell. For a heartbeat, no one moved, the weight of his condemnation pressing down on every relative seated at the table. Then Robert exploded, shoving back his chair so violently it crashed into the wall. "This is a setup!" he roared, his face crimson with rage. He was senile, dying, confused. She manipulated him. He jabbed a shaking finger at me, spittle flying as his voice cracked. "You think you can just waltz in, play nurse, and steal $50 million over my dead body?" Cynthia gasped dramatically, pressing her hand to her chest as if she might faint. "This is obscene!" she wailed, her tears sudden and suspiciously dry. "Edward promised us. He said family comes first. This girl is no family of ours." Her words echoed with desperate conviction, but her eyes betrayed something sharper fear, that the comfort she had expected was vanishing before her. Veronica's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Cold, sharp, deliberate. "This little nobody," she hissed, each syllable dripping with venom, "has twisted all of you with her false humility. She poisoned his mind against us. I will see her stripped of every cent if it takes me to my dying breath." Her stare seared into me, daring me to break. Before I could speak, Charles Hill stood his presence commanding, his voice firm. "Enough!" Mr. Whitmore was neither senile nor manipulated. He anticipated these accusations, and he took steps to ensure his intentions could never be mistaken. He reached into his briefcase and produced a thick folder bound with red string. "In here," he said, placing it deliberately on the table, "are transcripts of my meetings with Edward. Recordings, signatures, every detail documented. And if you require more, there are medical evaluations confirming his full mental capacity until his final week." The folder landed with a heavy thud that seemed to drain the room of air. Robert froze, his fury faltering. Cynthia's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Even Veronica's confidence flickered, her eyes narrowing at the folder as though it were a weapon aimed directly at her heart. Charles leaned forward, his gaze sweeping across them. "You are welcome to contest this will in court, but I assure you, you will lose." Mr. Whitmore left behind not just a decision, but irrefutable evidence of why he made it. He was clear, deliberate, and unwavering. He paused, then added with quiet finality, "Grace Sullivan is the sole heir. That is the law, and more importantly, that is Edward's will." My pulse thundered in my ears, a mixture of fear and vindication. Around me, the family's fury simmered, but Edward's voice still lingered in the room, his choice undeniable, his trust unshakable. For the first time, I felt the shift, the power tilting. I was no longer the outcast nurse shrinking under their ridicule. I was the heir Edward had chosen, and nothing they could say would undo it. Charles Hill waited until the shouts and curses dwindled into a tense, hostile silence. Then he drew a sealed envelope from the folder and held it up with deliberate care. Mr. Whitmore also left a personal letter. He said, his voice resonant in the charged air. His gaze flicked briefly to me before sweeping the table. He requested that it be read aloud in this room in the presence of all who claim his blood. My breath caught. My hands clutched the armrests of my chair. I felt every eye drilling into me as Charles broke the seal and unfolded the heavy parchment. His voice was steady as he began. "My dearest Grace." A ripple ran through the family, gasps mingled with scoffs, but Charles pressed on. "Yes, I call you Grace, though in my heart you became something more, the daughter I never had, the only true family left to me. I know this letter shocks you. Perhaps you doubt my reasons. Let me tell you plainly, you gave me dignity in my last months. You gave me laughter when my body offered only pain. You gave me truth when others gave me flattery. You showed me the kindness that wealth cannot buy." Tears blurred my vision as I clung to each word. Around the table, the Whitmores stiffened, the force of Edward's voice rising from the page like a ghost in the room. Charles continued, "To those who sit here angry, let me say this. Grace did not beg for my fortune. She earned my respect. She earned my trust. And if that makes you furious, let it. Better fury than indifference, for indifference is all you ever gave me." Robert swore under his breath, but the fight in his eyes wavered. Cynthia's face flushed as though the words themselves had exposed her theater. Veronica's mouth tightened into a thin line, but her pearls quivered at her throat. Charles's voice softened as he read on. "Grace, my wealth is now yours. Use it not as a chain, but as wings. Build the clinic you dreamed of. Offer safety to those who have none. Let kindness, not greed, be your compass. And when you doubt yourself, remember this legacy is not money, it is the love we leave behind. You are my legacy now." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the finality of Edward's judgment. No protest could stand against those words. They were not legal arguments or cold documents. They were Edward's heart laid bare. I pressed my trembling hand to my mouth, tears slipping down my cheeks. For the first time since stepping into that room, I felt not humiliation, but vindication. The Whitmores shifted uneasily, their fury tempered by the undeniable truth. The nurse they had mocked, the woman they had dismissed, had been lifted above them by Edward's own voice. In that moment, their power fractured, and mine began. The last words of Edward's letter lingered in the room like incense, sweet and inescapable, binding everyone in silence. For a moment, no one dared breathe, as if even the walls were listening. Then the sharp scrape of Veronica's chair shattered the stillness. She surged to her feet, eyes blazing, her voice trembling, not with grief, but with venom. "This is a fraud," she spat, jabbing a finger toward me. "She is a nobody who wormed her way into his heart while the rest of us carried the Whitmore name for generations. Do you think one letter, one sentimental performance erases bloodlines? This girl is nothing." Her words cut through the air, but the fury behind them sounded more desperate than triumphant, as though she felt her grip slipping away and could not bear it. Robert muttered his agreement, pounding his fist against the table, but his outburst lacked conviction. Cynthia dabbed her eyes, her theatrics muted, unable to conjure sympathy in the face of Edward's undeniable truth. I rose slowly, my legs trembling, yet steady enough to hold me upright. The eyes of the room followed me, some burning with hate, others wide with reluctant respect. My voice was quiet at first, but it carried. "You've called me nothing my whole life," I said, meeting Veronica's glare. "When my father died, when my mother remarried, when you stepped into our home, you made sure I felt less than human. You shoved me away from the dinner table, you called me a servant, you sneered that I'd never be more than a nurse. And today, here in this room, you tried to strip me again of my dignity. But Edward saw what you never could. He saw me as worthy. He saw me as family." Veronica's face twisted, but I pressed on my words, gathering strength. "You measure worth in pearls and gossip and power." Edward measured it in kindness. "And that is why his legacy is not yours. It is mine. Not because I demanded it, not because I schemed for it, but because I gave him what none of you ever did. I gave him love." My voice caught, but I did not falter. "And that is something no lawyer, no contest, no rage can take from me." The room fell utterly silent. Even Robert lowered his gaze, his defiance wilting. Cynthia turned away, her shoulders trembling with hollow sobs. Veronica's hand shook as she gripped the chair back, her nails digging into the leather, but she found no words. Edward's voice preserved in the letter, and the video had stripped her of her weapons. All she had left was bitterness, and bitterness could not win against truth. Charles Hill closed the folder with a soft thud that felt like the final gavel. "The matter is settled," he said. His tone brooked no argument. I remained standing, tears wet on my face, but I did not bow my head. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of chains fall away. In that silence, I was no longer the girl mocked as nothing. I was Grace Sullivan, heir to Edward Whitmore's legacy, and I was free. The following days in Charleston were a blur of whispers and headlines. The Post and Courier ran the story under the title, "The Nurse Who Inherited $50 Million." Church ladies clutched their pearls over coffee neighbors muttered behind half-closed shutters, and Veronica's name floated through the air like a curse. Yet the fiercest confrontation was not in the press, but in the grand hall of the Whitmore mansion itself, where the family had gathered one last time in a futile attempt to salvage pride. I had been summoned by Charles Hill to settle household matters, but when I arrived, Veronica was already there, her spine stiff, her mouth curved in a smile that was more snarl than grace. Robert stood beside her, his jaw clenched, Cynthia hovering at his elbow, eyes darting like a trapped bird. As I stepped into the room, their stares struck me like arrows. Veronica wasted no time. "Do you feel proud of yourself, Grace?" She hissed, her voice slicing through the stale air. "Parading around town as though you earned this. You may have fooled Edward with your quiet eyes and nurse's pity, but you will never be one of us." Her tone dripped venom, but this time the bite did not pierce me. I inhaled slowly, letting the weight of her insult roll off like rain against stone. Then I lifted my voice calm but firm, so the walls themselves seemed to carry it back. "For years," I said, meeting her glare, "you told me I was nothing. At the dinner table you shoved my plate away and called me a servant. When I left home at 18, you said I'd never survive, and when I stood by Edward's side in his final months, you mocked me as a nurse too lowly to sit with family. But you were wrong. Edward saw me. He heard me. He trusted me. I felt my voice tremble, then strengthen, gathering momentum. And in choosing me, he showed the truth that bloodlines mean nothing if they are poisoned with greed and cruelty. The room shifted. Robert's scowl faltered. Cynthia's hand stilled against her lace handkerchief. Veronica's lips curled, but her eyes flickered, the crack in her confidence widening. I pressed forward, my words no longer quiet, but sharp, deliberate, undeniable. This mansion, these walls, this legacy, you thought they were your crown. But they are Edward's gift, and Edward's voice is louder than your lies. You cannot humiliate me anymore, because I refuse to carry the weight of your scorn. The shame belongs to you. Silence followed, thick and suffocating, as if the house itself held its breath. For the first time, I watched Veronica falter, her mouth opening, then closing without words. The woman who had defined my worth with cruelty for decades now stood powerless before the truth. And in that silence, I felt the scales tip. I was no longer the girl she mocked. I was the woman who had turned her venom into ashes. The silence in the Whitmore mansion stretched brittle as glass until Veronica finally snapped. "Charleston will never accept you," she spat, her voice rising in desperation. "You can wave Edward's fortune around, but the circles that matter, the people who hold real influence, will see you for what you are. A charity case. A fraud in borrowed pearls." Her words dripped venom, but her eyes betrayed the panic of a woman watching her empire crumble. I stepped closer, my heels clicking against the marble floor, each sound deliberate, echoing like a drumbeat. "Charleston already knows," I said evenly. "They read it in the papers, they heard it in the church halls. They know Edward chose me, and more importantly, they know why. Because I gave him dignity when no one else did. Because I stood by him when you circled like a vulture. You can't erase that truth. You can only live with it." Robert muttered something crude under his breath, but he didn't meet my eyes. Cynthia turned her face away, her facade of tears collapsing into a hollow mask. I pressed forward, my voice rising steady, unwavering. "For years you tried to break me. You made a child feel like a servant in her own home. You told me I'd never be more than the dirt under your shoes. And yet here I stand, not because I clawed my way into your family, but because Edward chose me over you. The shame you hurled at me has turned to dust, and the world now sees you for what you are, a woman who mocked kindness and lost everything for it." Veronica's face blanched, her hand tightening on the back of the chair as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her mouth opened, but no words came, and in that moment, I realized the final blow had landed. The woman who had controlled every room she walked into, who had sneered at me until I believed her lies, now stood stripped of power, her cruelty exposed for all to see. I turned then to Charles Hill, to Mrs. Clark and Mr. Allen, who lingered in the doorway, silent witnesses to the reckoning. "This is not just about money," I said, my voice softer, but carrying through the hall. "This is about truth. And the truth is that Edward's legacy will not be squandered on greed. It will live on in the clinic and the lives we touch, and every person given hope instead of humiliation. That is what he wanted. That is what I will give him." As I spoke, I felt something inside me settle. The chains Veronica had wrapped around me since childhood had fallen away. I was no longer the girl who flinched under her ridicule. I was Grace Sullivan, and I had turned her scorn into my crown. The reckoning was complete, and the future, Edward's future, was mine to carry forward. The days that followed the confrontation spread like ripples across Charleston, each wave carrying whispers of the Whitmore scandal into every corner of the city. The Post and Courier ran a second feature this time, with a photograph of me walking out of Charles Hill's office, the headline blazing across the page, "The Nurse Who Defied the Whitmores." Coffee shops on King Street buzzed with talk of betrayal and legacy. In the pews of St. Philip's congregants leaned close, their voices hushed yet sharp as they recounted how the great Edward Whitmore had chosen not blood but compassion as the heir to his fortune. For Veronica, the fallout was swift and merciless. Invitations she once commanded with ease vanished overnight. The Charleston Women's Guild, where she had ruled with iron courtesy, quietly removed her from its leadership circle. At luncheons once filled with laughter and flattery chairs grew cold around her. Friends who had nodded eagerly at her gossip now avoided her gaze. In a city where reputation was currency, Veronica's had been spent in one reckless outburst too many. Robert fared no better. His threats of contesting the will collapsed under the weight of Charles Hill's documents and Edward's damning video. Word spread of his failed lawsuit, and he became the punchline at cocktail parties. Cynthia's theatrics turned to dust as society women whispered behind lace fans about her crocodile tears. The Whitmore name, once untouchable, became a cautionary tale told over mint juleps in candlelit parlors. Wealth without kindness crumbles faster than sand castles against the tide. Yet as their world withered, mine began to unfurl in ways I had scarcely dared to dream. Reporters sought me out not for scandal, but for the story of a nurse who had cared without expectation. Strangers stopped me on Broad Street, pressing my hands, telling me they had read Edward's letter in print and wept. A mother in the market clasped my arm and whispered, "What you did for him. I hope one day someone will do that for me." Each encounter left me shaken, humbled, but also burning with a sense of responsibility. I realized then that Edward's words had not only freed me from Veronica's grip, but also bound me to something greater. His fortune was not mine to hoard, it was mine to wield. The vision I had shared with him in the quiet hours, the clinic that would open its doors to women and children fleeing violence to families crushed under medical debt, was no longer a dream scribbled in the margins of a notebook. It was the path before me, clear and urgent. Edward had trusted me with his name, his wealth, and his final hope. Now it was my turn to prove him right. By winter, the vision that had once seemed so fragile began to take shape in brick and mortar. The Whitmore mansion, with its red brick walls and wrought iron gates, no longer echoed with silence and greed. Renovation crews filled its halls, stripping out gilded wallpaper and polishing the wood floors, not for opulent parties, but for exam rooms and waiting areas. The grand dining hall where Veronica had once sneered at me became a reception area lined with sturdy chairs and soft lamps. The study where Edward had whispered his regrets transformed into my office, though I kept his photograph on the desk, his gaze steady, reminding me why I was there. We named it the Sullivan Free Clinic, not out of vanity, but to mark the turning of a page, my family's name reclaimed from bitterness, rewritten as hope. On opening day, the air around Forsyth Park in Savannah hummed with anticipation. Families stood in line beneath the oak trees draped with Spanish moss, children tugging at their mothers' skirts, the scent of fried chicken and pecan pie from food trucks mingling with the crisp January air. Volunteers bustled, nurses checked charts, and local pastors offered prayers over the threshold. I stood at the entrance in a simple navy dress, my hands trembling, watching as the first patient, a young mother clutching her infant, stepped across the doorway. Inside, laughter and tears mingled as doctors offered care without asking for insurance cards, as children discovered shelves of donated books in the waiting room, as survivors of violence found counselors waiting with open arms. One woman clutched my hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. "I left last night," she whispered, her voice raw. "I had nowhere to go. And now, I have this." Her eyes brimmed with tears, and in that moment, I knew Edward's legacy was alive, not in boardrooms or balance sheets, but in the beating hearts of those who had been invisible for too long. Reporters came, cameras flashing, but I kept my words simple. "This is not about me," I told them. "This is about every person who deserves care and dignity." Edward believed in kindness, and this is his gift to Savannah. The articles that followed no longer carried the sting of scandal, but the warmth of transformation. At night, when the clinic grew quiet, I walked the halls alone, touching the smooth banisters, breathing in the scent of fresh paint and possibility. I paused often at Edward's portrait, whispering the same words again and again. "We did it. Your kindness lives on." And though the world outside still buzzed with gossip and grudges within those walls, I felt a peace deeper than anything I had ever known. The chains of my past had been broken, and in their place stood a legacy that would outlive me. A legacy of compassion carved not into marble or money, but into lives forever changed. The first weeks of the clinic's opening were a whirlwind, but it was in the quiet evenings that the deeper truth began to settle in. I would sit at my desk in what had once been Edward's study, the lamp casting a soft glow over the pages of his letter that I kept framed beside me. Each word seemed to reach across the months, reminding me not only of what he had left behind, but of what he had seen in me. For years, I had carried the weight of Veronica's voice, her sneers etched into my bones like scars. Even after inheriting the fortune, even after the world acknowledged Edward's choice, I feared those words would never loosen their grip. But as I watched women walk into the clinic with bruises fading from their faces, children clutching dolls to their chests, and families sighing with relief after years of struggle, I realized something extraordinary. Veronica's voice no longer defined me. One night, as the city lights glimmered beyond the windows and the moss on the oak trees swayed in the cool air, I allowed myself to remember. I remembered the dinner tables where I had been told to stand in silence, the bus ride to Savannah with nothing but a duffel bag, the long nights at Savannah Memorial Hospital when exhaustion threatened to crush me. Those memories had once been a chain dragging me down. Now they were threads in a tapestry, each hardship woven into the strength that had carried me to this moment. I was no longer the girl forced to shrink in Veronica's shadow. I was Grace Sullivan, a woman who had turned pain into purpose, who had reclaimed her name and reshaped it into something whole. The community began to embrace the clinic not as a curiosity, but as a lifeline. Pastors brought parishioners, neighbors brought neighbors, and slowly the building that had once symbolized power and exclusion became a symbol of belonging. Children scribbled thank you notes with crayon hearts, mothers left pies on the doorstep, and nurses from across the region volunteered their weekends. Each gesture reminded me that Edward's faith had not been misplaced, that the legacy he trusted me with was blooming into something real. In those moments of reflection, I understood that inheritance was never truly about money. It was about freedom, the freedom to rewrite a story, to shed the lies others had pressed onto me, to stand without shame in the place where cruelty had once tried to silence me. And as I whispered a prayer of thanks into the quiet, I knew the past no longer held me hostage. I was free. On the first anniversary of the clinic's opening, I found myself alone in the chapel room we had set aside for quiet reflection. A single candle flickered on the table, and above it hung Edward's portrait, his eyes crinkled in that half-smile I had come to love. I sat with his letter in my lap, the ink fading slightly, but the words as powerful as the day Charles Hill first read them aloud. Kindness is the truest inheritance. I traced the line with my finger, letting the weight of it settle deep inside me. Those words had carried me through humiliation, through doubt, through the fury of a family that once mocked me. They were now the cornerstone of everything I had built. As I looked back over the year, I thought of the countless faces that had passed through our doors, the child with asthma who could finally breathe again, the mother who escaped a violent home and found shelter, the elderly man who said the clinic reminded him of the kindness he had thought the world had forgotten. Each of them was proof that Edward's wealth had been transformed into something living, breathing, enduring, and in every smile I saw echoes of him. Not the billionaire the city had known, but the lonely man who once asked me if it was too late to leave something good behind. My answer had been no. And now, every day, the clinic itself spoke that answer louder than I ever could. I knew Veronica still whispered my name in bitterness across Charleston, that Robert and Cynthia still carried the sting of defeat. But their voices no longer touched me. Their empire had been built on cruelty and greed, and it had collapsed in the face of one truth: love is stronger. My inheritance was not just the clinic, not just the fortune. It was freedom from their hold. It was the discovery that even a life shaped by ridicule could be remade into one shaped by dignity. If Edward had given me anything greater than his estate, it was the reminder that family is not written in blood, but in choice. He chose to see me when others did not. And now I choose to see those who walk into my clinic not as cases or numbers, but as souls deserving of compassion. That to me is the truest legacy. When I left the chapel that evening, the air outside was crisp, the oaks lining Forsyth Park, whispering in the breeze. I lifted my face to the stars and whispered, "Thank you, Edward. I will carry your love forward." And for the first time in my life, I felt entirely at peace. knowing that my past no longer owned me and my future was built not on wealth, but on kindness, an inheritance no one could ever take away. If this story struck a chord with you, I want to take a moment to talk directly to you, the one sitting on the other side of the screen. Grace's journey was about more than money. It was about breaking free from years of humiliation, finding the courage to stand tall when others tried to silence her, and learning that kindness, not cruelty, is what truly lasts. And I wonder, have you ever lived through something similar? Have you ever been mocked, dismissed, or told you were less than only to prove through quiet strength that you were more than enough? I know many of you watching are carrying stories of your own. Stories of family conflict, of being underestimated, of having to fight for dignity in places where you should have been loved. These stories matter. They are not just chapters from your past, they are testimonies of resilience that can inspire someone else who might be listening right now. So I invite you share a piece of your story in the comments below. It doesn't have to be long. Just a moment, a lesson, a turning point. Because when we speak our truths, we remind each other that we're not alone. And let me ask you this. Do you believe that true inheritance is about money? Or do you believe, like Edward did, that it's about kindness, compassion, and the legacy we leave in people's lives? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I know that the conversation we start here can be as powerful as the story itself. If Grace's fight for dignity resonated with you, if you've ever stood up to toxic voices in your own family, I'd love for you to hit the like button. It may seem small, but every like tells the platform that these kinds of stories matter, that people want to see them, and it helps this community grow so more people can find encouragement when they need it most. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing that today. We share stories like Grace's stories about justice, resilience, betrayal, and redemption every single week. By subscribing, you'll never miss a moment where someone's life takes an unexpected turn and reminds us all of what really counts. And don't forget to tap the notification bell. That way, you'll always be the first to know when a new story goes live. Before you click away, I want to leave you with this question. What legacy are you building right now? Not in money or possessions, but in love, kindness, and the way you make others feel. Write it down, share it, live it, because at the end of the day, that's what people will remember. Thank you for spending your time with this story. Until next time, take care of yourselves, hold on to hope, and keep building legacies of kindness.